It was supposed to be a routine oversight hearing on federal transparency spending. The chamber was quiet, with members thumbing through notes and aides passing last-minute documents. Senator Chris Van Hollen had just finished a dry, self-congratulatory statement praising his office's commitment to accountability. Then Pam Bondi was recognized. She stood slowly. Calm, poised, almost surgical in her demeanor. The former Florida Attorney General flipped through a small leather binder, glanced once at Van Hollen, and then leaned toward the microphone. "Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit a document for the record, one that contradicts everything Senator Van Hollen just said." The chamber fell still. Van Hollen blinked, his posture tightening. Bondi didn't wait for approval. She held up a manila folder marked, "Confidential, Oversight Inquiry." This report details a pattern of hidden discretionary accounts and concealed transfers tied to organizations with direct links to the senator's campaign staff. And I'm not just talking about dollars, I'm talking about deception. Gasps. Reporters shifted in their seats. The room stirred. Van Hollen leaned forward, suddenly red-faced. "That's outrageous. This is a smear job, and you know it." Bondi didn't flinch. "No, Senator. What's outrageous is the paper trail your office left behind." The chairman banged the gavel in an attempt to regain order, but it was too late, the match had already been lit. Murmurs exploded into open murmuring as senators exchanged glances, aides whispered into earpieces, and cameras zoomed in on the folder in Pam Bondi's hand. Van Hollen stood up now, visibly shaken. "Pam, this isn't how we do things here. If you had legitimate concerns, you could have brought them to the Ethics Committee." Bondi raised an eyebrow. "The Ethics Committee? You mean the same committee you quietly influenced last month to delay an internal audit tied to these exact accounts?" The room erupted in gasps again. Even long-time members of the committee were visibly rattled. Bondi flipped open the folder. "Let me read you something. February 9, 2025, a $275,000 transfer to a so-called education nonprofit, in Maryland. That nonprofit's director. Your campaign's former finance chair." Van Hollen's voice cracked as he tried to speak. "This is political theater." "No, Senator," Bondi cut him off sharply. "This is corruption in plain sight." The chairman once again slammed the gavel. "Order. This hearing will not descend into personal attacks." Pam remained standing. "This isn't personal, Mr. Chairman. It's public. And the American people deserve to know where their tax dollars are going, even if it makes some of us uncomfortable." The cameras were rolling. Twitter was already on fire. And Van Hollen, for the first time in the hearing, had no words. As tension filled the air, a senior committee aide handed Bondi a stack of printed exhibits. Without breaking eye contact with Van Hollen, she passed copies to the clerk for the official record. "Exhibit A," Bondi announced, "details the $275,000 transfer I just mentioned. Exhibit B outlines 6 more, totaling $1.8 million, routed through shell nonprofits, each connected to individuals tied to the senator's office or campaign network." Van Hollen's jaw clenched. He reached for his microphone but hesitated. For a moment, he looked less like a powerful senator and more like a man calculating damage control. "You have no proof I authorized any of this," he said finally. Pam leaned in. "You don't have to authorize it directly, Senator. The money moved through entities under your oversight. Your former aides are listed on the 990 forms. And you've appeared at every gala those nonprofits hosted." Another wave of stunned silence swept the chamber. One of the junior senators whispered to another, "She came locked and loaded." Van Hollen tried to regain footing. "This is a coordinated smear campaign. I've spent my career fighting for accountability." "Then you should welcome this investigation," Bondi interjected coldly. "I'll be forwarding this evidence to the Inspector General and the Office of Congressional Ethics before the end of the day." At that moment, reporters began leaving their seats, not out of disrespect, but to race to the press room. Phones were buzzing. News alerts were going live. The chairman leaned forward, visibly tense. This committee is now in recess for 10 minutes. He banged the gavel. Van Hollen shot a glare at Bondi. She didn't flinch, only calmly gathered her documents, her expression unreadable. She hadn't just shaken the room. She'd changed the trajectory of the hearing. As the gavel echoed through the chamber, the room emptied like a fire drill. Reporters rushed out with phones glued to their ears. Staffers trailed their senators with tight jaws and faster steps. Security teams clustered near exits, sensing the storm already brewing beyond the committee room. Van Hollen stormed down the hallway, flanked by 2 aides who whispered furiously into their earpieces. "Get ahead of this," he snapped. "I want a full denial statement drafted. Emphasize partisanship. Discredit the sources," one aide interrupted, breathless. "Sir, it's already trending. Bondi Bombshell. Fox, CNN, even C-SPAN cut to live analysis. Your team's being flooded with press requests." Van Hollen's face dropped. Meanwhile, Bondi remained inside the chamber, alone for a moment with her binder. A soft smirk flickered across her lips, not of arrogance, but certainty. She didn't come to grandstand. She came with ammunition. In the hallway, Senator Marsha Blackburn approached her, whispering under her breath, "I don't know what you're holding, but whatever it is, it's radioactive." Pam replied coolly, "Then Congress better wear hazmat suits." "I'm not finished." Downstairs, in the Capitol Press Gallery, screens lit up with side-by-side footage of Bondi's statements and the highlighted transactions. Political analysts were already dissecting the implications. One anchor said bluntly, "If even half of what she claims checks out, Senator Van Hollen is in deep, deep trouble." But the real chaos was still coming, because Bondi hadn't shown her final piece yet. The 10-minute recess stretched into 20. When the senators returned to the chamber, the energy had shifted. Whispers gave way to silent stares. Everyone could sense it, Pam Bondi wasn't done. Not yet. Van Hollen entered last, his expression steeled but clearly worn. His team had tried to contain the explosion, but the fuse was already deep into the powder. Bondi calmly resumed her seat, then requested the floor again. The chairman hesitated, but granted it. She stood slowly, eyes scanning the room. "Before we adjourn, I have one final exhibit to submit. It's from a whistleblower. Former staffer in the senator's Maryland district office." She held up a small USB drive between her fingers. "This contains internal emails, payment routing instructions, and, most damning, a memo written by the senator's own chief of staff outlining how to reclassify campaign donations as community outreach expenditures through third-party fronts." The silence was deafening. Even Van Hollen's allies looked stunned. "This is absurd," he finally shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "You're waving flash drives and hearsay. You think that passes for evidence?" Pam didn't raise her voice. "No, Senator. But I think federal investigators might disagree." The chairman intervened quickly. "This hearing is adjourned. All materials will be reviewed by legal counsel before any action is taken." The gavel came down, but no one moved. Pam slid the drive into a protective envelope and passed it to a congressional clerk under escort. She didn't even look at Van Hollen as she gathered her notes and walked out. Outside, the rotunda was swarmed by press. Microphones, cameras, shouted questions. Pam Bondi stopped at the podium, gave one look into the cameras, and said, "I came to ask questions. But if Congress won't answer, the public will." She walked away as the press shouted her name, and Van Hollen's team scrambled to contain a fire that now had oxygen and heat. Back in Van Hollen's private office, panic had set in. Staffers were closing blinds. His communications director was on the phone with legal counsel, and a younger aide sat frozen at a laptop, refreshing Twitter, watching the Bondi footage rack up millions of views. They're calling it the Bondi files, she murmured. Van Hollen paced. There's no way she has that memo. No way. That was never. He stopped mid-sentence as his chief of staff walked in, pale. Chris. I need to tell you something. About the memo. Silence. Meanwhile, across the Capitol, Bondi met quietly with 2 members of the Oversight Committee and a federal liaison. She laid out the remaining evidence, bank records, internal correspondence, and a sworn affidavit from the whistleblower. One congressman leaned back in his chair, visibly stunned. You realize, if this moves forward, it could trigger a full ethics inquiry. Possibly criminal referrals. Pam nodded. That's exactly why I brought it to the floor. This wasn't a stunt. It was a warning. Outside, the media frenzy reached fever pitch. Bondi had refused every interview request so far, only issuing a single statement: truth isn't partisan. If public officials misuse power, the public deserves accountability, no matter their party. That night, cable networks aired back-to-back segments dissecting every allegation. Analysts pulled tax filings, matched names, and highlighted inconsistencies. Editorials ranged from cautious to outright explosive. But the real tremor came the next morning, when a formal letter was leaked. It was from Van Hollen's own staffer. A resignation letter, and a confession. The leaked resignation letter hit inboxes and news feeds like a thunderclap. Dated that very morning, it was signed by Andrew Kellerman, Van Hollen's longtime deputy policy director. The letter was addressed to the Senate Ethics Committee and began with a line that instantly went viral: I can no longer remain silent while documents are altered, nonprofits are misused, and the public is misled. The letter confirmed everything Pam Bondi had alleged, and more. It outlined deliberate efforts to funnel excess campaign funds into nonprofits created by former aides, then laundered through consulting contracts back into campaign-friendly operations. It also confirmed the memo. Yes, the memo exists. I was in the room when it was discussed. It was crafted to create plausible deniability while shielding the senator from direct association. Social media erupted. News outlets interrupted programming for live coverage. Hashtag Kellerman letter shot to the top of trending topics. By noon, journalists had staked out Van Hollen's office, his home, and the federal courthouse. In the Senate chamber, a grim-faced Van Hollen was seen leaving abruptly, no statement, no comment, flanked by security and 2 lawyers. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi remained measured, silent. When asked for a reaction, she offered only this: courage isn't staying loyal to power. It's staying loyal to the truth. By late afternoon, 2 key Senate Democrats released statements supporting an independent ethics probe. And by nightfall, the Justice Department quietly confirmed it had received materials relevant to an ongoing review. Congress had never seen a scandal detonate so fast, so hard, and so surgically. But Bondi wasn't done yet. By the next morning, Washington wasn't just buzzing, it was boiling. Every major outlet had shifted to wall-to-wall coverage. Talk of ethics violations turned to whispers of indictments. Van Hollen's name was now inseparable from the unfolding scandal. On Capitol Hill, staffers from both parties began reviewing past committee votes and appropriations connected to the flagged nonprofits. Some realized, to their horror, that they, too, had unwittingly co-sponsored or signed off on initiatives linked to those funds. Pressure mounted for action. In a hastily scheduled press conference, Senate Majority Leader Carson Griffin took the podium. The allegations brought forth are deeply troubling. While due process is essential, we must also maintain the integrity of this body. I support an immediate bipartisan ethics investigation. It was a thunderous blow. Back inside the Capitol, Van Hollen was locked in a war room with attorneys and damage control consultants. But the leaks kept coming. A second whistleblower emerged, another former staffer, this time from a nonprofit board tied to the case. And then came the moment that pushed everything over the edge. Pam Bondi released the full 13-page affidavit from her primary whistleblower, publicly, in a press release. It detailed dates, names, financial records, and included copies of internal communications. Most damning was a section implicating Van Hollen in knowledge of the financial transfers. He reviewed every quarterly report personally, the affidavit read. "We were told, make it look clean. Bondi's watching." The crowd of reporters outside the Capitol nearly doubled. That night, Bondi finally agreed to one interview, a live segment with PBS. This was never personal, she told the anchor. This was about truth, oversight, and protecting taxpayer trust. If a sitting senator can misuse the public purse, then walk away without consequences, we lose more than money. We lose the public's faith. The anchor asked, cautiously, "Is this the end of the story?" Pam's reply: "Not yet. There's one more piece." The following morning, just as the nation was beginning to grasp the scale of the scandal, Pam Bondi released one final piece of evidence, and it was nuclear. A digital press release went live at 7 a.m. sharp. As promised, this is the last piece. Audio from a private staff retreat, recorded by a Narazian deputy, confirming direct knowledge, intent, and orchestration. Within minutes, the 2-minute recording was everywhere: news broadcasts, Twitter threads, podcasts, even radio morning shows. The voices were unmistakable. It was Van Hollen, laughing with 2 top aides. "As long as it's laundered through outreach and printed with the nonprofit's letterhead, we're clean. Pam Bondi can dig all she wants, we'll be 10 steps ahead." Another aide chimed in, "Until someone flips. Van Hollen, then we bury them in process. Ethics complaints take years." The arrogance. The clarity. The strategy. It was the final nail. By noon, 3 more senators, including one from Van Hollen's own party, publicly called for his resignation. The Ethics Committee announced an emergency meeting. DOJ officials issued a statement confirming they were escalating the timeline of their inquiry. Even the White House, typically cautious about Senate scandals, broke its silence. The press secretary offered a blunt response: "The president believes anyone who undermines public trust should face full accountability, regardless of title." Outside Van Hollen's office, protesters gathered with signs reading, "Resign now," and "Truth Power." Meanwhile, Bondi's calm demeanor never wavered. When approached by reporters, she simply said, "I didn't burn the house down. I just pulled back the curtain." But behind the scenes, something else was unfolding. A small group of senators, bipartisan and deeply concerned, had started private talks. Whispers of a formal expulsion resolution had begun. Within 48 hours of the audio's release, Capitol Hill was engulfed in quiet meetings, emergency phone calls, and after-hours huddles. The damage was beyond repair, and every senator knew it. By Tuesday morning, Senator Julia Rourke, a respected moderate from Colorado, stepped up to the microphone with a single piece of paper in her hand. "Mr. President," she said on the Senate floor, her voice steady, "I submit Senate Resolution 418, calling for the formal expulsion of Senator Christopher Van Hollen from the United States Senate." The chamber went still. There hadn't been an expulsion vote in decades, not since the darkest days of scandal and betrayal. And yet here it was, backed not only by Republicans, but a growing list of Democrats who could no longer defend silence. Bondi watched from the visitors' gallery, seated in the back row, her expression unreadable as Rourke read the resolution aloud. "Whereas Senator Van Hollen is credibly accused of misappropriating federal funds, directing fraudulent nonprofit activity, and obstructing ethics oversight, whereas these actions constitute a breach of public trust and a violation of Senate standards, be it resolved that Senator Van Hollen be hereby expelled from the United States Senate." The gallery gasped. Across the city, newsrooms dropped everything to cover the vote. Social media erupted. Headlines blared, "Expulsion in motion, bipartisan backing for Van Hollen's ouster, Bombshell turns TO ballot, Bondi's reckoning reaches ITS peak." Within hours, Van Hollen appeared before the press, not to fight back, but to announce what many suspected. I will not put this chamber, or this country, through a prolonged spectacle. Effective immediately, I resign from the United States Senate. He turned, walked away, and didn't answer a single question. Inside, the Senate clerk struck his name from the roll. Pam Bondi left the gallery quietly. She didn't gloat. She didn't speak. She just walked out into the sunlight, past a row of reporters and cameras, her message already spoken in full. Not through outrage. Not through partisanship. But through proof. Senator Van Hollen's resignation triggered a political shockwave that rippled far beyond the Capitol. By sunset, multiple state and federal agencies announced formal investigations into the nonprofits named in Bondi's exhibits. Subpoenas were issued. Bank accounts frozen. Several former aides retained criminal defense attorneys. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi became the unexpected face of institutional accountability. Networks ran hour-long specials titled "The Woman Who Took on the Senate" and "Bondi's Battle: How One File Shook Washington." Editorial boards, including those that had once criticized her, praised her tenacity, precision, and refusal to politicize the scandal. But Bondi stayed out of the limelight. When approached by 60 Minutes, she declined the offer. When asked if she would run for office again, she simply replied, "I'm not here to climb ladders. I'm here to make sure no one kicks them out from under the people." Still, the impact was undeniable. Within weeks, the Senate Ethics Committee released a new bipartisan transparency package, nicknamed the Bondi Reforms, aimed at strengthening oversight on nonprofit disclosures and closing pass-through loopholes for campaign funds. Whistleblower protections were expanded across federal offices. A handful of senators, worried about past practices, preemptively disclosed ties to questionable groups, hoping to avoid becoming the next headline. In a symbolic moment, the now vacant seat left by Van Hollen was filled by a special election. The victor? A former federal prosecutor who ran on a single slogan, "Truth has no party." On her way to a private legal seminar months later, Bondi was stopped by a Capitol custodian. He didn't ask for a selfie or an autograph, just smiled and said, "You gave people like me a reason to believe again." She nodded, thanked him quietly, and walked on. Her job was never about the cameras. It was about the country. Months passed, and the dust began to settle. The committees completed their reports, indictments were unsealed, and several of Van Hollen's former aides struck plea deals. The once powerful senator, now a private citizen under federal investigation, had vanished from public view. But the ripple effects of Pam Bondi's intervention never stopped. Universities taught her case in law and ethics courses. Congressional briefings cited her tactics as a model for responsible whistleblower engagement. A best-selling non-fiction book, The Bondi Doctrine, detailed how one folder, one voice, and one moment of courage had reshaped Senate procedure. Bondi herself declined all offers of political endorsements, lobbying contracts, and TV deals. Instead, she quietly launched a nonprofit watchdog group focused on financial transparency in government, staffed by former auditors, forensic accountants, and, notably, two of the original whistleblowers from the Van Hollen case. 1 year to the day after her bombshell testimony, a ceremony was held in the same chamber where it all began. Bondi was invited to speak. She stood at the same podium, no fanfare, no flashy entrance. "This place doesn't need more noise," she said. "It needs more nerve." She paused. "The truth doesn't shake buildings. But when you refuse to bury it, it just might rebuild them." The room stood in silence. Then applause. Not performative, but earned. She stepped down from the podium the same way she had entered it, steady, focused, and unshaken. History would remember the moment not for the chaos it caused, but for the clarity it demanded. Pam Bondi had not just uncovered a scandal. She had restored a principle.